I think we'll get started. I'm going to allow the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. They're very able and confident and have a lot of ability in this area and a lot of knowledge. So I'm going to allow Gavin and Helen to introduce themselves before their slides. The reason for this webinar is due to popular demand. We've had a lot of questions from members on this subject, and Helen and I wrote an article on it, which was very well publicized. So we thought we would write a wind webinar. We've been talking about this with Gavin for a while, and eventually we've managed to bring it to the forefront here for you to all see. So before we start, we're quickly going to look at life cycle analysis, and you may ask what relevance does that bear to FuelEU Maritime? But it does bear a lot of relevance, because remember, with the FuelEU Maritime, when you're using wind power, then you will also be using fuel as well as wind. A lot of these, what we're talking about today, is wind assisted propulsion systems. It's not just purely wind, it's wind assisted. So when we look at life cycle analysis, let's look at it from start to finish. Historically, and if you look at the EU ETS, the emissions trading system, all that looks at is the capturing the fuel, and I'm circling it here for those of you live on the webinar, capturing the fuel from the fuel tank all the way throughout the storage and service systems through the main engine until it produces wake. So that is known as tank to wake. However, the whole process from start to finish goes all the way throughout, where I'm highlighting here with the laser pointer. So that includes harvesting and extraction, conversion, production. So if you're using a zero or low carbon fuel at the end of the process, but the process is very carbon rich in its entirety, then, for example, if you use an old tractor which is clapped out and using old fuels and old engine technology, then it's going to add to your complete carbon footprint throughout the whole cycle. And that's why at the top left here, we have pictures of renewable energy, wind, solar, and hydroelectric power. So that's basically the life cycle analysis. And you can see here, there's a formula used for that within the FuelEU Maritime, and that will come to relevance to those of you dealing with this at a later stage. So on to the EU Fit for 55, because that's what we're here to talk about today. We're talking about FuelEU Maritime, the wind reward factor and wind technology. So we just thought we'd give you a quick overview of the Fit for 55 policies. Fit for 55 EU policies are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990. And that's in tandem with ever expanding fleet sizes. So it's an easy way to remember the Fit for 55. It's a 55% reduction. Let's compare the EU ETS to the FuelEU Maritime. Just have a quick look through some of the peculiarities here. Remember, the EU ETS has been around for a number of years in the shoreside industry, recently expanded to the maritime industry. It's a polluter pays principle, as it says here. It promotes energy saving, efficiency, and energy transition. And its emission factor is from tank to wake. So it's a small part of the process that we were looking at before in the picture. Whereas the FuelEU Maritime promotes the use of renewable and low carbon fuels in maritime transport. And it addresses fuel technology, and it's an emission factor from well to wake. So that's going all the way throughout the process that we're talking about before there. There's somebody in the audience saying there they can't see the slide, but I think everybody else is okay. I haven't had any other complaints, so I'm sure the slide deck is coming across. So hopefully, Stavros, you can see that, and I've just received a thumbs up there. So hopefully you can get it on another screen. Okay, there's a few people saying, but there's a few people giving us thumbs up there. So hopefully that'll come back to the other people. So let's have a look at the FuelEU Maritime timelines. Okay, so this question was asked during the registration process, so we've put an extra slide in there. So so basically what this is looking at is the monitoring and compliance. So effectively we've now passed the first monitoring plan period, which is the 31st of August 2024. Monitoring starts on January 2025, and the FuelEU report submitted to the verifier on the 31st of January 2026. We can then see the companies to include pool vessels from that period onwards and to calculate advanced compliance with the remedial payments on the 30th of June 2026. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later and why that's important. So the next thing we're going to look at here is compliance technologies, and we're going to look at what is relevant to the FuelEU Maritime and what is not so relevant to the FuelEU Maritime. We're focusing on wind power today, so you can see anything that's in green is favorable on the FuelEU Maritime. That's not to say that some of these other products don't help you with some of the other decarbonisation regulations, but today we're looking at the FuelEU Maritime. So you can see the kite sail system, wind powered, solar powered, and various other powered are favoured under that. The next thing we're going to talk about now is the wind reward factor, because that's part of the reason we're here to talk about wind power. And it's important to see here that we've got at the top there the wind reward factor. This is something which is effectively given back to those ship owners who are going to use wind power. And we're going to talk about how that works and the mechanics behind that at a very high level. We're not going to spend too much time on it and go into too much detail. So at the top there, you'll see WAPS, WAPS. That's wind assisted propulsion system. And that's very important to remember. So it's assisting as opposing to be the sole power of propulsion. And it reduces GHG intensity through a wind reduction factor. And the formula sits behind that, but it's quite complicated. We're not going to spend too much time going into it. But all you need to know is that the formula basically looks at the wind, the propulsive wind power caused by the wind sails on board the vessel themselves, and it compares that to the propulsion power of the ship itself. And that gives you a range, an intensity range of between 0.95 and 0.99, and that equates to between 0.05 and 0.15 of a wind reward factor. So basically, you're getting more back for your money when it comes to FuelEU Maritime compliance when you're using wind power. And here we're going to very quickly go through some calculations, but we're not going to spend too much time on it. We just want to give you a very brief overview and a case study. And this is based on real life calculations. So the only thing I want to say here is the bulk carrier. This is a Cape-size bulk carrier. It's 182,000 tons. So that's approximately, and based on EU fuel consumption, that's 4,590 tons of fuel oil used during the reporting period. That equates to over 17,000 tons CO2. And if you can imagine now, the average car weighs just less than 2 tons. That just gives you some sort of a scale of exactly the amount of CO2 these ships are producing and the importance in reducing this CO2 and therefore the carbon footprint. So we look after all the calculations here. I'm not going to spend too much time on the calculations. I've put them there so that when we have the slides out afterwards, people can go through them and look in detail. But the main thing you need to know here is that the compliance penalty at the bottom for this bulk carrier during the reporting period would be €285,538. So that's the compliance penalty. And we'll go into more detail later exactly what the compliance penalty is. But effectively, that's obviously amount that would need to be paid or could be pooled. We could look at a pooling arrangement, and we shall discuss that later on. So next, if we look at this diagram now, we're now looking at a wind-assisted carrier. We can see that by the sails at the bottom here, which have been added to give the effect. And it's the same size ship, but obviously we've had a slight reduction in fuel consumption. We've been on the conservative side here. We've said a 5% reduction in fuel caused by the wind sails. So that then brings the CO2 levels down to 16,000 tons CO2. That's over 1,000 tons less than we had in the previous example. And what this then equates to after we've gone through all the calculations is that we now have a compliance surplus of €161,681. So that's a surplus. So instead of being deficit, like we referred to in the last slide, you're actually in surplus because of the wind technology on board the vessel. And these are real world figures. These are not just figures we've manufactured. These are from EU reported data. So you can see on the left-hand side here, we've got a bulk carrier which has a compliance penalty of €285,538. But on the right-hand side, we have a vessel that if it had been using wind power, it has a compliance surplus. And that then brings us into some of the pooling and banking discussions, which we'll refer to later. Pooling and banking is something that we have tried to help our members with, and there'll be a press release coming out on Thursday to this effect. We've collaborated with a company called Bettersea, who has an end-to-end seamless platform, and it basically allows ship owners to pool with other ship owners who are in compliance. So if you're in deficit, you can pool with those that are in surplus, and if you're in surplus, you can trade the other way around effectively with that owner. The system collaboration we brought into place is basically where if we use a 20,000 TEU container vessel, for example, then there will be a saving of about 45% on your compliance costs, and then approximately another €45,000 per ship for NorthStandard members only. So that's for NorthStandard members only and not for non-members. So we'll be doing a webinar on that on the 18th of March. Keep an eye out for the press release, please, and we'll go into more detail about that. So we're going to discuss some of the FuelEU Maritime topics here, effectively again. So the pooling, effectively, the pooling is between one ship owner and another, effectively. And what happens on something like the Bettersea platform is that they will have a seamless transition between one of the platforms, between one of the sides and the other. We'll go into more detail on that later, but effectively that allows some ship owners to bank their compliance even from as early as now, and they can bank it for later stages. On the other side, you will have ship owners who are using, for example, wind technology or biofuels, who are basically able to achieve a surplus. So it's basically an advantage on one side and obviously a disadvantage on the other. And there's financial consequences and gains to be had. Back onto the ship itself now before I hand over to Gavin, and I just really want to bring out a few points here that, we like to be quite balanced on our view on these technologies. One of the things that, you may think is that when you've got this wind technology on board, there's aesthetics to consider. You're going to have extra items to paint, extra items to coat. It's something else to corrode and not look good. So that's something that you have to consider. There's spares requirements on board as well. You have spares, and the ship owners we've spoke to who have this wind technology on board, they're basically getting supplied spares with that. But obviously, as time goes on, those spares become depleted, and who knows what you may need during the course of your voyage. Will the gains really make that much difference on engine wear? Well, our understanding is that the engines work in close tandem with the sails, so you have systems in place to prevent them to increase the efficiency when they're used together. But then you have other things to consider, such as hydraulic oil filters, retractability, time and equipment, and then dry dock. And then you've got the questions of potential off hire and maneuverability as well. So with that, I'm then going to hand over to Gavin, who's then going to, if you could take control, please, Gavin, and if you could go through some of the more detail and introduce yourself as well to the audience, it would be great to hear on that. Thank you. Thanks, Gavin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, brilliant. And thank you, Mark and Helen and NorthStandard for inviting me to come and talk a little bit about and give you an overview of wind propulsion. So my name's Gavin Allwright. I'm the Secretary General of the International Windship Association. So we represent the technology providers and the technology development with over 200 members worldwide. And that ranges from everything from research and development organizations, technology providers, ship owners with installations, and we have 6 class societies as associate members as well. So I'm going to give you a rattle through at quite a pace, but you will have all of these slides delivered to you later by Mark and Helen. So as Mark mentioned, wind propulsion is really developing. We've got a lot of momentum coming through. I will touch on the technologies briefly. Then I'll take a look at the market for you, and then just give you a couple of reference ideas as well, and some of the drivers and barriers that are continuing. So very quickly, wind propulsion technology. Basically, we're looking at using an energy source that is zero emissions, and this is completely zero emissions, not just to air, but to water, underwater radiated noise, etc., etc. It's delivered directly to the vessel at the point of use without any need to mine, refine, transport, bunker, or store on the vessel. So you're receiving this energy, and this is why it's been included into the FuelEU Maritime, recognized as an energy source, but a little bit at the time of its development was a little bit difficult to incorporate fully into the formula, so the reward factor was given. And we're looking also at a technology that's in the market. The zero compatibility issues which are mentioned here means basically you can use wind with any other fuel source or technology that you're looking to implement on your vessel. These are fully automated systems that we're talking, or mostly fully automated or increasingly automated systems. So you don't need additional crew to operate these. And I put maybe a little cheeky comment there around zero capex. There is a possibility here to lease systems, to do a pay-as-you-save model where you actually are paying for the technology, and that is paid for by the fact that you're using a zero-cost fuel. So the fuel savings pay for the technology. From a retrofit perspective, you're looking at 5 to 20% propulsive energy delivered on a wind assist vessel, possibly optimized up to around 30%. But remember, this is on a vessel that you are not changing the operational profile at all. So you're operating, excuse me, you're operating the vessel as a motor vessel, but with wind help. Now, if you start weather routing, if you start changing, optimizing for wind, then you can push those levels higher. And if you're developing a new build project, then we even have projects that are looking at 100% plus, where actually the excess energy is captured, harvested, and then stored on board as either electricity or changed into fuel. But you're looking at very large amounts if you're doing a primary wind vessel. And there are 7 technologies here, which I will just quickly go through here. So we have the rotor sail, which is a rotating cylinder. And this is not a generator. This is actually using power, rotating the cylinder, and then the wind catches that and uses the Magnus effect, which is a little bit like a spin ball or a curve ball in baseball. It creates a whipping effect and generates thrust perpendicular to the direction of the wind. We have a suction wing or a suction sail. This was developed by Jacques Cousteau back in the 1980s. And it's a rigid sail with a ventilation system which sucks in the boundary layer around the sail. And as if any of you are sailors, you're probably aware that yachts using wind can go 2-3 times the speed of the wind, because we're not actually looking at wind doesn't push the vessel, although it does at times. It actually sucks the vessel. It's the difference in the pressure differential on either side of the sail creates the thrust. Very much like an aircraft wing lifts a very heavy aircraft into the air. Then we have hard sail or rigid sails, which are quite familiar to a lot of people. There's many different variations of these. Soft sail or hybrid sail. And again, there are many variations here. These are more traditional sails. We even have an inflatable sail that's developed by Michelin in the picture at the base. And these systems are used on all different types of vessels. Kites, which were mentioned by Mark earlier on, we've had a couple of iterations of these, and these are using quite a lot of aeronautical technology now, drone technology, etc. And these operate about 200 to 300 meters above the vessel, where wind is blowing consistently almost all of the time. And then we have two other smaller segments. One is a turbine, which can generate electricity, but also can generate some thrust as well, depending on the configuration. And then the hull form, where the actual hull of a vessel, this would be new builds, is designed to be acting like a very large wing sail itself. Now, the market potential. Or the market where we are. We're actually, I can give you an update. We're around 60 vessels in operation today, which is about 4 million deadweight tons of shipping. Everything from small coastal freighters right up to VLCCs and VLOCs. So some of the largest ships in operation in the world, mainly in the bulker, tanker and ro-ro segment, with a fairly large number of general cargo. Container ships, we only have a single one at the moment, using a containerized system, but we also have, I think, eight or nine wind-ready vessels currently. So it's about 60, edging up to 70 vessels. And by the end of this quarter, and this estimate was made about half a year ago, we're expecting to be around 80 to 90 vessels in operation. So 87 here, but that may have a little bit of slippage depending on yard capacity, etc. The estimates, and of course, we're always very optimistic in the Windship Association, so we try to use third-party assessments. The one on the left was an EU report released in 2016-17, looking at up to 10,700 installations by 2030. Now, this was before COVID, so of course, again, there'll probably be 12 to 18 month slippage there, but we're pretty much on track there, and I'll show you that calculation in a moment. And then the UK government did an estimate in 2019, taking that out to 2050 and looking between 40 to 45% of the fleet installed with wind at that time. We feel that that's actually a little bit conservative. Indeed, well over 80% of the fleet would quite easily take wind, and the other probably 20% could be installed with modifications. Now, the industry trend, these are figures from DMV, looking at LNG, LPG, methanol, hydrogen, ammonia. And the green that's coming up here is basically the number of installations that we've had of wind. As you'll see, 2024, there was a fairly substantial jump in these, and we're looking at effectively doubling the number of vessels in operation every year going forward. And we have a pipeline currently of about 80 ships for delivery in 2025 and early 26, and announcements for another 50 vessels which haven't been ordered but are in the mix at the moment. And as you'll see, by around 2028, we're effectively topping that 1,000 plus vessel aspect. If we continue doubling, as you'll see, that would effectively give us around, we're getting into that realm of that 10,000 in 2031, 2032. And these are just a few of the announcements that we've had very recently. We're moving from single vessel orders into multiple vessels and indeed fleet orders. And the largest one here, the largest one here is the one in the top left, which is FuelEU Maritime, which is a UK-based tanker vessel company, and they've ordered 34 tankers to be installed over the next 2 to 3 years, but definitely over the next 2 years. MOL in the bottom right actually has a plan for 80 vessels by 2035. Maersk Tankers, obviously a big name there, ordered 5 MR vessels this year, and I think those will be delivered by the end of this year or early 26. And we actually did a survey in 2023. We're releasing a new survey within the next couple of weeks, reaching out into the market and asking the question, if you had 5 options for energy in the mix, what would they be in 2030 and what would they be in 2050? And this is a very common approach that's used by a lot of think tanks, etc. But what hasn't been done before is giving the option for wind and wind assist, so primary wind and wind assist. And as you'll see in the bottom 3 slots there, combined wind assist obviously was a far stronger option for 2030, but by 2050 primary wind was also coming in quite strongly there, and this was around 60 stakeholders, including 19 ship owners, but excluded any members from IWSA. So gives you, it's not a definitive survey, but gives you an indication of the changing in perspective of wind in the industry. And part of that, one of the drivers for that is, as we've heard, we have the EU aspects, which are in green here. So the EU ETS, having shipping included, FuelEU Maritime, but also all of the discussions in IMO and the developments in IMO. We had the CII, of course, which is a little bit controversial, but EEDI, EEXI, and now the strategy in 2030 of delivering a 20 to 30% reduction in emissions, and 2040 a far higher one. Now, all of this is driving wind propulsion. It's a pipeline of regulation that is giving us a compliance pressure. And as you can see, the pink dotted line is where we see wind propulsion developing. And the inflection point where the market takes over, where we're not pushing demonstrators into the market and trying to show the market how this works. The market is feeding itself. We see that around 2026. So as we top 100 demonstrators, then the market starts to take over. And indeed, not earlier this year, late last year, we had MEPC 82 at IMO, and we submitted to include wind propulsion in the GFI formula, which is slightly different to the FuelEU Maritime. FuelEU Maritime is very much on the fuel. The GFI proposals or the GFS proposals are very much on the vessel. So actually including wind propulsion much more integrated into the formula of the energy used for the vessel for the work that that vessel does. And that's received quite a lot of support, but nothing decided until everything is decided in IMO. So we're still working on that, and also the measurement calculations as well. Now, just to talk, I'll spend the last 5 minutes of my time just considering some of the barriers, and then just a few reference points. So not barriers, but considerations. So when we're putting wind assist onto vessels, so yeah, somebody's just asked GFI, so it's the global fuel intensity, or the GHG fuel intensity, my apologies. So very similar to a FuelEU Maritime aspect. So when we're putting wind assist onto a vessel in retrofit, of course, the vessel isn't optimized for wind. So there's always going to be some trade-offs. For example, your freeboard on the side of the vessel will create turbulence over the deck. So that may actually diminish a little bit the power that is delivered from wind. And remember that wind can give you anything from 100 to 0% of your energy requirement at any given time. So to have an energy management system that can cope with various levels of wind power being delivered to the vessel is important too. So the the more integrated that energy management system can make the wind, the more benefit you will get. So there are optimization and integration areas that can improve the amount of power that's actually delivered to the propulsive movement of the vessel. But with a new build, of course, you can minimize or integrate those systems very easily, so you're going to get higher benefits there. And some of the barriers that we have in a more macro sense, of course, policy. There are issues around sort of charter terms, allowing you to route for wind. Obviously, things like the coal regs and SOLAS requirements. These need to be complied with. Generally, we work very closely, or our members work very closely with class. As I mentioned before, six of our associate members are class societies. So there's a lot of integrated, joined up thinking when it comes to these aspects, and no system is put onto a vessel without it being fully compliant with all of the existing regulations. Price, that's something we can't mitigate too much, but we obviously including as much of the emissions into the price of price of fuel is important, so we can show wind propulsion has that zero cost element. And as I mentioned before, leasing, rental, modular systems are also coming into the market now. Small penetration yet, but could be a very interesting model there as well. Providers, we're increasingly seeing tech providers. I think there are 13 or 14 now in the market already, and we have a pipeline of others coming through. A large number of demonstrators with hundreds of thousands of hours of operation of systems now. So we're not talking about untested systems, but the data is a little bit of a competitive advantage at the moment. We're seeing more data coming into the market, and that will certainly improve as we're going forward. The people, we're seeing certainly a change in perspective, as I've already mentioned, among board members, among a little bit slower in the finance and insurance fields, but we hope that is changing as we move forward. And perception, even 2 to 3 years ago, if I was talking about wind propulsion, most people would think of Jack Sparrow and the Pirates of the Caribbean. Now that perspective is changing, and it's more, these are modern technologies using modern materials into the market. And I'll just use my last couple of minutes just to talk about a few reference points. China, obviously, we're seeing some very large vessels being built. All of these vessels are in operation now. VLOCs, VLCCs, some quite large, other large bulkers, and some special use vessels. I think now around 30 vessels have been installed in China alone. And we're talking for the VLCCs and the VLOCs, probably 6 to 8% at present for the large installations, up to 10%. The PIX Association, I think, just announced they'd been saving about 1.5 tons per day on their operations. But of course, there's always going to be variations on what routes you're taking. Are you making any changes for the wind? All of these numbers that I've just mentioned are numbers without any change to that operational profile whatsoever. So you could be just heading into the wind because you have a direct route that you want to follow. So if you are making changes and the weather routing technology now is improving dramatically, you can pretty much plug in your route, plug in your ETA, and then find 20 to 30 different routes that will give you savings or maintain your ETA depending on what is your priority at the time. And then we go on to the larger vessels, primary wind vessels. I just wanted to mention these because two of these are actually two of these are already in construction. The Neo line on the left side has just been launched, and she'll be fitted with her sails over the next couple of months. And the Chantier d'Atlantique cruise vessels, two of these are in construction currently at present, so for delivery probably 2026. And these significantly increase the amount because they're new builds and optimized, as I mentioned before. And this is just my last couple of slides. So we like to think of this as a win-win-win situation. All of these companies are involved with wind propulsion. Not all of them are members, but all of them are heavily involved, either installing or developing their own technologies or support and suppliers. So we're not quite that mainstream technology that every ship is going to have on board, but certainly a huge number of mainstream players are involved and increasingly investing hundreds of millions, if not billions, into this segment at present. And we're looking at roughly a production capacity in the high hundreds at the moment. We're just waiting for the market to pick up so they can be delivered into market. And my final point is, we always have a very busy wind propulsion diary, and we actually have a wind propulsion conference in Singapore during Singapore Maritime Week. So if anybody's interested in that, please drop me a line. It's an invitation-only summit where we'll be discussing all of these issues over 2 days in depth. So you're all most welcome to apply for an invitation. We can't guarantee them, but we'd love to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gavin and Mark as well. So I'm going to just finish with a few points in this presentation. But as Mark requested, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Helen Barden. I'm a director in our external affairs team and spend quite a lot of time looking at matters of maritime decarbonisation. So if we just move on to the points that I am planning on covering today. So we've obviously heard from Mark and Gavin about the different wind propulsion technologies, the benefits that it can bring in terms of emission savings, and also the impact of that in the regulatory context, and in this regard, the FuelEU Maritime that's been discussed. Understandably, these kind of benefits and practicalities and regulatory impacts need to be addressed commercially as well. So, for example, as between owners and charterers in the charter party context. So I'm going to look at the following points that I've put out on this slide. The wind propulsion system and its impact on charter party terms, charterers' orders, and also the issue of split incentives. So first of all, the wind-assisted propulsion system and its impact on the charter party terms. So where the system has been retrofitted onto the vessel, we're dealing with new technology that's been installed onto the vessel. So terms of the charter party that could be impacted by such installation do need to be properly considered. If the wind propulsion system is to be installed during the period of a charter party, then consideration obviously needs to be given to the time and the cost of such installation and how that installation will happen with minimal disruption to the charterer's use of the vessel. I'll deal with the issue of split incentives at the end, as I mentioned, but it might be the case that if charterers are paying anything towards the time and cost of the installation, that kind of impacts upon how this point is addressed in the charter party. Another point just to mention is the vessel's description. So as Gavin's very helpfully highlighted, there's not just one type of wind propulsion system, but rather various different types of system available on the market. The system that is installed on the vessel would need to be properly described in the vessel's description, and that would include detailing any potential amendments in relation to speed and consumption warranties. And any restrictions that might be caused, for example, in relation to berthing. Clauses dealing with the likes of maintenance, breakdowns, repairs that also need to be looked at. So while the wind propulsion system, once installed, will form part of the vessel's whole machinery and equipment, and will likely come within the maintenance obligations set out in the charter party in this regard, and therefore the usual position would be that that rests with the owners in terms of it being their responsibility. If the wind propulsion system has been installed at the cost of both the owners and the charterers, so that the capex cost, for example, has been shared, it might also be the case that the parties want to give specific consideration as to how time and costs of maintenance and repairs are dealt with. And in terms of the what happens if the system breaks down, for example, obviously, it means the benefit of the wind propulsion will be lost for the period of the breakdown. And as a consequence, it's going to mean that there is more fuel that needs to be burned for the same voyage. Or it may be possible to slow steam the vessel more slowly so that those fuel savings can be achieved. But that would obviously mean you've got an impact on the length of the voyage. So how that is addressed in the charter party needs to be looked at, whether it's going to be an off-hire event, for example. Usually an off-hire event will be provided for in standard time charter terms, where there has been a breakdown of machinery or equipment. And as I mentioned, I'll come on to the issue of split incentives towards the end. But again, how that capex cost, for example, has been dealt with between owners and charterers could well influence how the parties want to address those issues. Just very briefly, in the voyage charter context, some of these issues won't really come into play, because unlike with a time charter, there isn't that kind of longer term interest in sharing the cost of the system potentially. So most likely what will happen is that if there is a wind propulsion system on the vessel, that will be installed at the cost of owners, and it would most likely be done between voyage charters to so that there's no impact on those voyage charters in terms of installation. That said, as with a time charter, if the installation of the system is going to impact in any way the way in which the ship can operate, then that should be provided for within the vessel's description. And then also, I suppose, if there are due dispatch obligations in the charter party, in the event of a breakdown, the question arises as to whether the master might potentially be obliged to increase the vessel speed to make up for the lost wind propulsion effect. So those are all issues that, from a voyage charter context, might need to be looked at. So just looking at another point within time charters and charterers' orders and weather routing. And under most time charter parties, the charterers have the right to provide orders of employment to the master. And that's a very key right under a time charter for charterers. Weather routing companies are often able to provide, or will be able to provide, routing guidance for ships with wind propulsion technology, as has been mentioned by Gavin, to make sure that the most optimum route is used for that system, to make the best out of the wind propulsion system. So if one route is going to be of more use for the wind propulsion system than another, then charterers are likely going to want to order the ship to go that route. And when it comes to charterers' orders, the master isn't really supposed to unduly question it. But obviously, if the order risks the safety of the ship, the crew, or the cargo, then the master can refuse to follow those orders. And it's also worth just pointing out that there is a distinction between an order of employment and an order of navigation. So employment clauses don't compel the master to obey orders that encroach on their responsibility for matters of navigation and seamanship. So employment relates to the economic use of the vessel, essentially. So decisions as to where the vessel's going to go, what cargo the vessel's going to be carried. but matters of employment have to be distinguished from matters of navigation, and those matters of navigation rest with the master. It's been held under English law that an order to sail from port A to port B is an employment order, which is as would be expected, but an order that the ship sail at a particular time is a matter of navigation, so that's a master's issue. Also, an order to proceed to an anchorage to lighten is an order of employment, but precisely where the ship should anchor is a matter of navigation. So in the context of weather routing, while an order by charterers to sail from port A to port B may be an employment order, would an order by charterers for the master to sail a specified wind optimized route between port A and port B be an employment order or be a matter of navigation? And there has been some case law on this, but not in such specific terms, I suppose. And the authors of time charters have written exactly where in practice the line between them, and by them they mean employment or navigation, is to be drawn in respect of routing orders given by or on behalf of charterers is capable of further clarification. For this purpose, the facts of the Hill Harmony were too extreme, and that's a case where the charterers ordered a vessel to go a northerly route because it was shorter, and the master refused and went a southerly route. The charterers' orders were on a large scale, and the master's reasons for disobeying them were unconvincing. A more precise distinction may emerge when there comes before the courts a case in which charterers give more detailed orders and the master makes out a better case for departing from them for reasons of safety or seamanship. So this is something that we'll have to kind of watch and see how it develops in English law. And just finally, I'm going to briefly touch upon this issue of split incentives. And what I mean by split incentives is where you have owners paying the upfront capex cost, in this case for the wind propulsion system, but it's the charterers that are getting the benefit. So whether that's by reducing their scope 3 emissions, reducing bunker consumption, and so getting fuel savings in that regard, or by reducing their exposure to regulatory costs, which we've already discussed in the context of FuelEU. And last year we interviewed MC Shipping, who have a wind propulsion system on a vessel, and also GT Wings, a wind technology company. And both agreed that understanding the efficiency savings is key to addressing the issue of split incentives, and the issue can be properly addressed commercially. So Gavin touched upon possibilities in terms of financing for these wind-assisted propulsion systems and an option of pay-as-you-save financing. And that very much requires an understanding of the efficiency that you're actually getting out of that wind-assisted propulsion system. I'm not sure how widely that is being used at the moment, but certainly in the charter party context, it would be possible to agree possibly an increased higher rate where the system is achieving a particular level of efficiency. But like I say, that understanding of actually what are the efficiencies being gained on a particular route is something that needs to be well understood between the parties. And obviously there isn't at the moment a standard way of calculating those efficiency gains. So my advice would be that charterers and owners will need to be, I suppose, on the same page and both interrogate the basis on which the owners are calculating the savings to ensure that any agreed methodology and verification is understood and agreed between the parties. So that brings me to the end of what I was going to say and gives us 10 minutes for questions. So I can just drop the slides.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Gavin. Excellent overview. We're just going to touch on a couple of the live questions first of all, and then after the live questions, we've got some other questions to answer. If anybody else has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll see what we can do to get to them before the end of the presentation. So first of all, Gavin, I'm going to pitch a question at yourself. There's a question there about maneuverability of the vessels. There's a question there about visibility. Obviously, I know that CCTV systems are being used and approved by classification and flag, as far as I'm aware, with some of these systems. We haven't heard huge operational problems of the providers we've spoken to, but perhaps you could just shine some light on that and some of the challenges you've seen with respect to maneuverability. I suppose really the questions come more within port operations, and perhaps you ask, well, whether the wind sails would actually be deployed in a lot of situations. So just based on your experience, if you've had any feedback, good or bad, Gavin, we'd really like to hear, and that would answer that question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course, I share all of the bad stuff. No. From a maneuverability perspective, as you rightly pointed out, you would be powering down your systems when you're in narrow navigation channels, when you're in port situations. You wouldn't be under wind power at those times. So in those situations, the maneuverability issue is not a concern, as would be the stability issues when in port or tethered, etc. So the maneuverability in or the sea situations, then you're looking at some issues around maneuverability, but most of those have mitigation aspects. So, for example, you may need to be using more rudder angle at times when you're receiving a lot of wind or a lot of wind energy to the vessel. So there are issues, and those are certainly there are processes to mitigate those, and we're also analysing. There's ongoing analysis of these under a number of programs that we're involved with. On the visibility aspect, yes, as you rightly say, cameras are allowed for very large installations by some flag designations. There isn't a standard allowance there at the moment within IMO, but that is developing as we're speaking now. But generally, the systems that are installed currently meet all of the visibility requirements, except, as I mentioned, there's a couple of large wing sails that have had those camera exemptions given. But for example, rotor sails, most of the bow-mounted wing sails are completely compliant with the visibility aspects, and a number of systems have also been deployed behind the bridge as well on vessels. So yes, it is a consideration. Also, radar blanks are a consideration, but most of them have either mitigation aspects or those are in the works for very large systems.
Thank you. That's excellent, Gavin. A question I'm going to throw across to Helen. I apologise in advance, Helen, but on the bill of lading and the deviation, would you be able to touch on that, please, Helen? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of deviations, where routing changes from the kind of customary shortest route, then those issues of deviation under the bills of lading do have to be considered, because deviations can impact P&I cover. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that needs to be considered.
Thank you. I think we've really covered off all the other questions. So I'm conscious it's 55 minutes into the presentation. If anybody else has any more questions, then please feel free to contact us now. Type it into the chat, contact us afterwards. Everybody who has signed up for the webinar will receive a copy of this. Now, normally we try to turn that around within a week, but we're extremely busy internally with a lot of promotions at the moment. So it will probably be more like 10 days or perhaps up to 2 weeks, but please bear with us. We will get the slides out to you as soon as possible. This will include a link to the video. It will also include a link to the PowerPoint slides in PDF format, and it will also give you our contact details should you need to contact any of us about any of these questions. I'm just looking now that just as we said that, another contractual question has come across our bow there. Helen, if you could please have a look at that one. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of ensuring that you're joined up in the charter party chain or down the commercial chain, including into the bills of lading, to address any issues around potential deviations, and that would be the best way to address it. I think sometimes the problem can be that you'll have clauses in the charter party, but they won't necessarily find their way into the bills of lading. So I think that's that's one of the points that's definitely worth looking at to cover that issue off.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you. So I don't think we've got any more questions in the chat. As I say, please feel free to contact any of us after the event. Would like to thank you all. You know, some of it's a very early start, and some of you it's quite late in the day. So thank you all for attending. Please bear in mind that on March the 18th, we're going to be doing our next webinar on FuelEU Maritime compliance systems and better seas. So that's a big discount for members. As we spoke about before, could be up to 40,000 euros per ship for NorthStandard members. So please tune into that. Please look at our Navigating Decarbonisation website, which we've sent a link to an article which takes you to that as well. Please feel free to study that. And please feel free to contact any of us, as we've said. We're more than happy to answer any questions on it. And with that, I would just like to say thank you to everybody. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll allow Gavin and Helen to say thank you too. I'm sure they've enjoyed this as well as me. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your day.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your day. Yeah.
Thank you.